The sun had barely begun its descent, casting a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Emily Carter stood on her porch, sipping a lukewarm cup of tea, watching her 6-month-old golden retriever, Bailey, prance around the backyard. He was an adventurous little thing, always darting toward the fence as if he had someplace to be. She chuckled more than once at his boundless energy, wondering how such a small pup could have such an insatiable curiosity. But today, something was different. Bailey had been unusually fixated on the wooded area behind their house all afternoon. Every time Emily called him, he'd glance back at her, hesitant, before turning toward the trees again. It was as if something, or someone, was waiting for him in the shadows. Then, as if making a split-second decision, Bailey disappeared into the underbrush. Emily's heart leapt. "Bailey," she called, setting down her mug and hurrying across the yard. She wasn't particularly worried. He had done this before, only to return minutes later, tongue lolling in satisfaction. But today, the eerie silence that followed made her uneasy. Minutes passed, then a rustle. Through the trees emerged Bailey, tail wagging, tongue hanging out, and bounding toward her like he always did. Relief flooded her, until she saw what was behind him. An identical golden retriever followed close at his heels. Same size, same soft caramel fur, same soulful brown eyes. Emily blinked, her mind scrambling for an explanation. Another puppy? A lost dog? A trick of the light? But as the stray edged closer, its eyes locked onto hers, warm yet hesitant, like it recognized her. Emily's breath hitched. There was something eerily familiar about this dog. Bailey barked excitedly, nudging his newfound twin toward her, as if proudly presenting a long-lost friend. But the moment Emily reached out, the stray flinched, stepping back. There was fear in its eyes, not of her, but of something else. And that's when she noticed the collar. Or rather, the remnants of one. Tattered, faded, barely hanging on. Emily's pulse quickened. This wasn't just any stray. This dog had a past. And somehow, it was tied to Bailey's. And what she would soon uncover was more than she ever could have imagined. Emily stood frozen, staring at the stray that had followed Bailey home. Her mind raced with questions. Where had this dog come from? Why did it look exactly like Bailey? And why did it seem both desperate and afraid? She crouched down, trying to coax the stranger closer. "Hey there, buddy. It's okay." Bailey wagged his tail excitedly, nudging the other dog playfully, but the stray hesitated. Its ribs were faintly visible beneath its fur, and its matted coat suggested it had been on its own for a while. Despite its weary state, something about it was familiar. Then, Emily's breath caught as she noticed something small and metallic glinting beneath the dog's tattered collar. A tag. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, careful not to startle the pup. The dog flinched but stayed still as she gently turned the rusted tag over. The letters were faded, nearly illegible, but when Emily squinted, she felt her heart stop. Bailey. Her head spun. No, that wasn't possible. She glanced at her Bailey, her playful, bright-eyed puppy, then back at the stray. The resemblance was uncanny. But this dog was older, more worn. Her mind scrambled for an explanation. A lost sibling? A parent? A coincidence? Before she could think further, the stray suddenly lifted its head, ears perking up. Then, without warning, it growled, a deep, guttural sound that sent shivers down Emily's spine. Bailey stiffened beside her, his playful demeanor vanishing in an instant. His hackles rose, and he let out a warning bark. Emily turned, her heart pounding. A rustling sound came from the trees. And then movement. A figure emerged from the shadows. A man. Emily's stomach clenched. He was tall, dressed in ragged clothes, his face obscured by the dim light of dusk. He stepped forward slowly, eyes locked on the stray. "Hey," Emily called out, her voice shaky. "Can I help you?" The man didn't answer. He took another step forward. The stray's growl deepened, stepping in front of Emily. Bailey did the same, baring his tiny puppy teeth. Emily's instincts screamed at her to back away, to run inside and lock the door, but her legs refused to move. There was something about the way the man was staring at the stray. not with curiosity or confusion, but with recognition. He knew this dog, and the dog knew him. Then the man spoke. "There you are?" Emily's blood turned to ice. The stray tensed, lowering its body into a defensive stance. It wasn't just scared, it was ready to fight. Bailey barked furiously, but the man barely acknowledged him. His focus was entirely on the older dog. "That's my dog," he said flatly, pointing at the stray. Emily's mind whirled. If this was true, why did the dog seem so afraid of him? Why did it refuse to go near him? "No, he's not," she said firmly, stepping between them. "This dog showed up with my puppy. He doesn't belong to you." The man's lips curled into a humorless smirk. "Yeah? Check his tag." Emily's hand tightened around the worn metal. She didn't trust this man, and neither did the stray. In the tense silence that followed, Emily barely had time to react before the man lunged forward. But before he could take another step, the stray attacked. With a fierce snarl, the dog leaped at the man, jaws snapping. The force sent him stumbling backward as the dog clamped onto his sleeve, yanking him down. Bailey barked wildly, joining in, nipping at the man's legs. Emily's shock turned into adrenaline. She grabbed the nearest thing she could, a garden rake leaning against the porch, and brandished it like a weapon. "Get away from us," she shouted. The man swore, trying to shake the stray off. But the dog wouldn't let go. And then, as if he realized he was outmatched, the man wrenched himself free, scrambling to his feet. He shot Emily a look of pure rage, then turned and ran, disappearing into the woods as fast as he had come. Emily stood there, her breath ragged, heart hammering. The stray watched the man go, its body still tense, ears alert. Then, slowly, it turned back to Emily. And, this time, when she knelt down and reached out, the dog stepped forward, pressing its head into her palm. Trembling, Emily stroked its fur, tears stinging her eyes. This wasn't just any dog. This dog had escaped something terrible. And somehow, against all odds, it had found its way to Bailey. To safety. To home. And Emily knew, in that moment, that she would do whatever it took to protect him. The night air was thick with tension as Emily sat on the porch, her fingers absent-mindedly stroking the stray's worn fur. Bailey lay curled up beside the newcomer, his tiny body pressed against the older dog as if comforting him. Emily couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind. The man, the attack, the way this mysterious golden retriever had fought for her. Fought like he had been waiting for that moment. She needed answers. Reaching for her phone, she snapped a picture of the dog's faded tag and ran a reverse image search. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. Maybe an old registration, a lost pet notice, something. Nothing. Frustrated, she turned her focus to the dog itself. He wasn't just any stray. His body language, his reaction to the man, he had the instincts of a trained protector. Was he a service dog? A police canine? Or something else entirely? Bailey stirred beside her, whining softly. The older retriever nudged him, offering silent reassurance, but his amber eyes remained locked on the tree line, watchful. Emily felt it too. Something was still out there. She shivered and pulled her jacket tighter. "Come inside, guys," she murmured, standing up. The older dog hesitated, but followed as she led them both into the house, locking the door behind her. A shadow in the night. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Emily lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house setting her on edge. Bailey snored softly at her feet, while the stray had curled up near the door, guarding. At 2:37 a.m., a noise snapped her awake. A rustling. From outside, her heart pounded as she sat up, ears straining. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, and they were right outside her window. Bailey whined, his little ears twitching. But the older retriever, he didn't make a sound. He simply stood, muscles tensed, eyes glowing in the moonlight as he faced the door. Emily's pulse hammered. Someone was watching them. Forcing herself to move, she crept toward the window and peered out through the curtain's edge. A dark figure stood near the trees. Not moving, not leaving, just standing there. A cold dread settled in her stomach. It was him, the man from earlier. Her breath hitched, and suddenly the retriever growled. A deep, bone-chilling sound that made the hairs on her neck rise. The man took a step forward. The retriever let out a single, warning bark. And then Emily heard it. A whisper, not from inside the house. From outside. From the man. Emily's blood ran cold as she saw his lips move. She couldn't make out the words, but she didn't have to. There was something wrong. Something about this wasn't normal. Bailey whimpered, pressing himself into Emily's leg. But the stray stood his ground, eyes locked onto the man as if he understood exactly what was being said. Then, the man turned and vanished into the woods. Not running, not stumbling, just disappearing. Emily exhaled, her chest heaving. She grabbed her phone, hands shaking, and called the police. The discovery. By morning, the police had come and gone. They'd searched the tree line, but found no trace of the man. No footprints. No evidence he'd been there at all. Probably just a trespasser, the officer had said. But keep your doors locked. Emily had nodded numbly. Now, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee, she stared at the golden retriever, her protector. Something wasn't adding up. This dog, he hadn't just been lost. He had been running from something. And somehow, he had found his way to Bailey. As if he was meant to. Her phone buzzed. It was her friend, Sarah, a local vet. Emily had texted her the night before, asking if she could scan the stray for a microchip. Bring him in, Sarah's message read. I'll check him out. Emily didn't hesitate. Answers and more questions. At the clinic, Sarah scanned the retriever while Emily held her breath. A beep. He had a microchip. Sarah's face darkened as she pulled up the information. Then she went still. Emily, she said slowly. You need to see this. She turned the screen around. Emily leaned in and felt her entire world tilt. The dog's name? Bailey. Owner? Deceased. Status? Missing for 2 years. Emily's mouth went dry. 2 years. This dog, this Bailey, had been gone for 2 years. And yet, somehow, he had appeared in her backyard the same day she brought her own Bailey home. It didn't make sense. But then, Sarah whispered, Emily, look at the last location recorded on his file. Emily did, and her stomach dropped. The location was miles away, a place Emily had never been. But the date was exactly 1 week ago. Emily met Sarah's eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. Where has he been all this time? Sarah shook her head. I don't know, but I think. Before she could finish, the older retriever growled. Both women turned and saw the shadowy figure standing outside the clinic window, watching, waiting, for Bailey, for both of them. And this time, he wasn't alone. A cold wave of fear washed over Emily as she stared at the shadowy figure outside the clinic window. Her breath hitched because this time he wasn't alone. 2 more figures stood behind him, their outlines barely visible in the dim morning light. The older retriever, Bailey, let out a low, guttural growl, his body rigid with tension. The hair along his spine bristled, and his amber eyes gleamed with something Emily had never seen before. Not just fear, readiness. He wasn't running anymore. He was standing his ground. Sarah reached for her phone. I'm calling the cops. Emily's pulse pounded. Lock the doors, she whispered. She grabbed Bailey's collar. Her Bailey, who was trembling but silent, his big puppy eyes darting between the older dog and the men outside. The shadowy figure stepped forward, pressing a hand to the glass. His lips moved. Give him back. Emily stiffened. Who? She knew the answer before she could even think it. The older retriever. Bailey. The original Bailey. Her throat tightened. What do you want? She demanded, her voice firmer than she felt. The man didn't blink. That dog doesn't belong to you. Something in his tone sent chills down her spine. Then who does he belong to? She shot back. For the first time, the man hesitated. The 2 figures behind him shifted uncomfortably. One of them muttered something under his breath. Bailey growled again. And then, in a single heartbeat, everything exploded. The man yanked something from his coat, a gun. Emily barely had time to react before the door burst open. The older Bailey lunged. A blur of golden fur collided with the man, sending him stumbling backward. The gun clattered to the ground. The other 2 men rushed forward, but before they could react, the retriever was on them. snarling, biting, fighting. He wasn't just defending Emily. He was defending himself. Emily scrambled for the gun, but before she could reach it, one of the men grabbed her wrist, yanking her back. Bailey, her Bailey, barked wildly, snapping at the man's ankles. Sarah screamed. The older retriever didn't stop. With a vicious snarl, he sank his teeth into the attacker's arm, yanking him down with a force that didn't belong to a mere pet. This was something else, something relentless. The man shouted in pain, trying to shake him off, but the retriever held firm until the police sirens cut through the chaos. Flashing lights bathed the clinic in red and blue. The men bolted. The older retriever released his grip, watching as they fled into the woods. Emily staggered back, gasping for breath. The moment the police stormed inside, the retriever stepped beside her, not as a lost dog, but as a protector, as something more. The truth. It took hours to piece everything together. The police identified the man, Daniel Rourke, a known animal trafficker. His operation? Illegal dog fighting rings. Bailey, the original Bailey, had been stolen from his original home 2 years ago. Somehow, against all odds, he had escaped, and instead of running aimlessly, he had found his way to Emily, to her Bailey. The question haunted her. Why? But then, as she sat in the quiet of her home that night, both dogs curled up beside her, she realized something. It wasn't just chance. It wasn't just instinct. It was something bigger, something unexplainable. Bailey hadn't just escaped. He had been led, because somehow, in a world full of people, he had found the one person who wouldn't let him go. And this time, he was finally home. The house was quiet that night, save for the gentle breathing of the 2 golden retrievers curled up beside Emily. Both Baileys were safe. The older retriever rested his head on his paws. His body finally relaxed for the first time since she'd met him. He had fought, endured, and survived things Emily could only imagine. Yet, despite everything, he had chosen to trust again. She reached out, running her fingers through his fur. "You're home now," she whispered. His tail gave a slow, contented thump. The aftermath. The following days were filled with questions, paperwork, and media attention. News outlets picked up the incredible story. A stolen dog, lost for 2 years, miraculously finding his way to another family with the same name. People called it fate. Others called it a miracle. But Emily knew the truth. Bailey had never truly been lost. He had been searching for safety, for love, for home. The police assured her that Daniel Rourke and his accomplices had been arrested. Their dogfighting operation was dismantled, and several rescued animals were now receiving care. But even with justice served, the scars of what Bailey had endured would always remain. Still, when she looked at him, she didn't see a victim. She saw a survivor. The decision. One afternoon, Emily received a call from the vet clinic. "His old family," Sarah said gently. "We found them." Emily's heart clenched. She had known this moment would come. Bailey had belonged to someone before, a family that had loved him before he was stolen. Now, they had a choice to make. Would they want him back, or would they let him stay? Emily barely slept that night, anxiety swirling inside her. She had never intended to take someone else's dog, but the idea of letting him go. She glanced down at the retriever sleeping by her feet. Could she say goodbye? The next morning, the phone rang again. The family had given their answer, and Emily's eyes filled with tears. They wanted him to stay. "We just want him happy," the woman had said softly. "And it sounds like he already is." Emily hung up, heart bursting. She knelt beside the golden retriever, cupping his face in her hands. "Looks like you're stuck with me, buddy," she whispered. His tail wagged, his eyes shining with understanding. Home. For the first time in 2 years, Bailey was truly home. A final message. Weeks passed. Life settled. But the story of Bailey, the survivor, the protector, the hero, continued to spread. People reached out, inspired by his resilience. Emily began volunteering at local shelters, helping other lost and abandoned animals find their second chance, just like Bailey had. Because in the end, this wasn't just a story about a dog finding his way back. It was about hope, about how love, true love, isn't bound by time, distance, or logic. It finds its way, just like Bailey did, and sometimes in the most unexpected ways. It finds you too.